Well, good morning, youth. We've been looking at chapters 7 to 11 of Exodus and the plagues in the past several Devos, which have shown us God's sovereignty over all of creation. Pharaoh asked, "Who is the Lord?" And God answered with the plagues by showing him that he is sovereign over everything, which effectively destroyed Pharaoh and Egypt's religious beliefs and worldview. Yet there's another thing about God's sovereignty that we see in these chapters. Did you notice what God says, or what this thing says over and over again about Pharaoh's heart in these chapters? Go back and read the chapters again and keep an eye out for that. It's subtle, but it's no less powerful, a no less powerful display of God's sovereignty. We see it from the very beginning of chapter 7 when God tells Moses and Aaron to go to Pharaoh and tell him to let the people go. Listen to what God says in verses 3 and 4. "But I will harden Pharaoh's heart, and though I multiply my signs and wonders in the land of Egypt, Pharaoh will not listen to you. Then I will lay my hand on Egypt and bring my hosts, my people, the children of Israel, out of the land of Egypt by great acts of judgment." So God is telling us he is sovereign over the human heart here. 14 times in the rest of this part of the story, the text tells us about Pharaoh's hardness of heart. And 5 of those times, it tells us directly, specifically, that God hardened Pharaoh's heart. God is sovereign over the human heart. As Proverbs 21:1 says, "The king's heart is a stream of water in the hand of the Lord. He turns it wherever he will." Yet sometimes this truth troubles us, doesn't it? When we hear God hardened Pharaoh's heart, we wonder, well, how can God actively harden Pharaoh's heart, but then also still blame Pharaoh for acting out of that hardness? God even says in chapter 10, verse 3, "How long will you refuse to humble yourself before me? Let my people go." God hardens and holds Pharaoh responsible. You see, this is a major paradox of Scripture, a tension in it. God is absolutely sovereign over everything. Man is still responsible for their actions. Yet, I'm not going to be able to work this out completely for you. And I know that may sound disappointing, but it's true. No human can work out this paradox completely. It's a paradox, which means there is a solution, but we don't know enough to know what it is. And you know, everywhere in the Bible where this question is asked, God never really gives all the explanation that we might want as human beings. Take Romans chapter 9. For example, there, when Paul is talking about God's sovereignty over salvation, he asks the very question we just asked, verse 19. "You will say to me then, why does he still find fault? For who can resist his will?" That's essentially the question we just asked about Pharaoh and God hardening his heart. And yet Paul's answer is this: "But who are you, O man, to answer back to God? What is molded say to its molder? Why have you made me like this?" Paul doesn't try to work it out. And I'll tell you, Paul doesn't try to work it out because I'm pretty sure he can't work it out. He simply says, God is God, you guys don't get to talk back to him. And if Paul can't work it out, you and I can't work it out either. But that doesn't mean that we can't get some partial answers that we actually see in the story that we'll go over the next couple of days about how God can still be sovereign and man can still be responsible for their actions, like with Pharaoh in this story. This is where the Reformed theological tradition, which is our church's theological tradition, really comes in handy and helps us. The Westminster Confession of Faith helps us here in its chapter 5, on providence, God's sovereignty. It says this: "As for those wicked and ungodly men whom God, as a righteous judge, for former sins does blind and harden," we could insert Pharaoh's name right here, "from them he not only withholds his grace, whereby they might have been enlightened in their understanding and wrought upon their hearts," that means it would have worked in their hearts, "but sometimes withdraws the gifts which they had, and exposes them to such objects that their corruption makes occasion of sin, and withal gives them over to their lusts." So did you hear the verbs there? God is active, but what is he doing? Withholding, withdrawing, exposing, giving over. And you see, by doing this, God just allows our natural sinfulness to take over. It's like human sinfulness is kind of like water being held back by the dam of God's grace. Yet if God removes that dam or cracks in that dam, sin rushes out. I mean, this is basically what Paul is saying in Romans 1:18 in the rest of the chapter. So by the way, go read that. Go read Romans 1:18 to the end of the chapter. And think about what God says there about human sin. And we'll talk more about this tomorrow. So I'll talk to you guys tomorrow. You guys think about that.